All right, everyone, welcome back. Day 6 out of 12. Um, so we're halfway through. Today, we're going to talk about holistic intention. So, this is the second element of the Eightfold Path. And the first two elements are about wisdom. So, this is the second half of the wisdom section. So yesterday was holistic either view or understanding, and today is holistic intention, and some people prefer to call it holistic thought. I like intention better because it's a little more specific than thought, but I mean, thought works too. So holistic intention. And remember, if you see this anywhere else, it's going to be right intention. So same thing. So intention is considered of the utmost importance in Buddhism. It drives our thoughts, it drives our speech, and it drives our actions. It propels our karma, meaning, and the karma has to do with cause and effect around our actions. And what that means is the fact that intention propels our karma means it's not what our actions look like from the outside that causes the kind of ripple of effects from our actions, but rather the intentions behind our actions that actually matter. So Adya Shanti says, in the end, we all get what we value most. And if we don't like what we've gotten, we had better take an honest look at what we are valuing. I'm going to read that again. I just love this. In the end, we all get what we value most. And if we don't like what we've gotten, we had better take an honest look at what we're valuing. So, what we value is like a compass for our lives. And what we talked about yesterday, is that there can be what we value kind of by default without thinking about it. And our whole life can go by sort of valuing, what society suggests, the kind of resume virtues, or just sort of default, not even thinking about it. And then our life can go one way. Or we can consciously, hopefully through this practice is encouraging us to consciously value what we deeply value, to consider what we deeply value and use that to orient our lives consciously. So, what we value is like a compass, let's say, for our lives, and our intentions are like the motor that sends us in that direction. And how does this happen? What's the mechanism? It happens because the way we act has consequences. And what we're talking about, again, is karma. So the way we act has consequences is like based on the intention behind it. That's like a definition of karma for our very practical purposes. Nothing woo, nothing weird. Very, and actually visible, although things, as I'm going to say later, are a little bit complex. So it's not like you always know everything about karma because there's too much going on. But it's not mystical. So here's some examples of how intention works through karma. Let's say you're patient with somebody, or you see the good in them, or you are clear and honest with them. In those three cases, the person's going to trust you. So that's a way of thinking about karma. Someone's going to trust you because you treat them, you speak clearly, you seem transparent, they feel safe with you. Or let's say you act in anger towards somebody. Then what's going to happen every time is that the person's going to become defensive. And they may have different kinds of defense mechanisms, but in some way they're going to oppose you to protect themselves. And then there are actually, as I say, that there are other responses, right? Someone could actually, we won't go into that. But one way, if you act in anger, one kind of consequence you might get is the person gets defensive to protect themselves. And now you are dealing with someone combative rather than the previous example, someone who felt safe. And then a third example, and this happens This is when it can feel confusing. If you act with mixed intentions, like you sort of want one thing, but you kind of want another thing too, and you're not totally sure, the person's going to be confused and you're going to get mixed results. And that was an area that actually took me a while to clean up. Like I felt the other was easier to figure out if I was sort of being understanding or being angry. But there were times when I would go into an interaction and not totally know what I wanted, and then be confused why I didn't really get any of the things I wanted. And that's because I was sending a mixed signal. And when you send a mixed signal, you kind of get a mixed response because the people don't, really know what you want because you don't really know what you want. So it has really helped me over the last few years. I guess I took on the practice for 2 or 3 years to like really clarify my speech and to not speak until I knew what I mean, you don't always know, but like when I could, till I knew what I wanted to say. And all of a sudden I started getting clear responses in the areas that had not been. So this is great stuff to play with and see, is it everyone else or is it you? And I'm not saying everyone else doesn't have the whole same thing going on. They do. So it's not like you can automatically clarify everything, but it makes a huge difference. Your intention comes through and people respond to it. So how does this happen? It's not just your words that matter. There's the inflection behind the words. There's body language. There's your tone of voice. Obviously, this is common sense, but it's important to think about. Also, people have mirror neurons. So they'll even feel a little bit of what you feel, regardless of what words come out of your mouth. There's a kind of resonance where if someone feels stressed, you feel a little bit stressed. If someone feels sad, you feel a little bit sad. That's just happening all the time. That's just how we're built. That's how we are communal and able to be social creatures together, is that's built into our nervous system. So that's why it matters, even if you sort of know what you want to say, if you don't believe it, it's going to come across mixed. So again, this is karma. It's essentially psychology, science. So folks are constantly reacting to how you are with them. And you're doing the same in response to their speech and actions and body language. We're interacting all the time based on the underlying intention. So if your intention is to want to understand someone and to be harmonious with them, things are going to go one way. And if your intention is to, let's say you've been raised to protect yourself by harming someone else before you can be harmed, or maybe to harm back, even worse, if someone seems to have a negative intent toward you, then your life's going to go an entirely different way, just based on that underlying intention to either understand or protect. So our intentions essentially like leak out everywhere into our lives. And then there's this question of like, so let's say I have some unwholesome intentions. Does anyone else know? Let's say you're a really good liar or actor or whatever, and you are able to hide your harmful intentions from other people. The problem in terms of karma is you can't hide them from yourself. So if you act, and this is a big part of the theory of karma, if you act with hurtful intent, or the science of it, if you act with hurtful intentions, you're going to assume that other people are doing the same thing because it feels like a reasonable and normal things to do. It feels like how the world works. So if you have these underlying harmful intentions, you're going to perceive negativity coming at you all the time. And you probably know someone with a really strong example of this. And then you want to look for the more subtle stuff probably in yourself. Because with you, it's probably not as obvious as, the most paranoid person you know, or the most negative person you know. But it's good to look at that as instructive and then think, in what ways do I do that in subtle ways? And it's so interesting because you can have a relatively happy and great life and still engage in these teachings and make subtle tweaks to how you are and have massive improvement, in my opinion, in how your life goes. So it doesn't have to be that you walk around hating everybody and then you switch to like loving everybody and whatever, which would take a long time probably. But I encourage you to look for little things, little ways that you can improve your relationships, improve how the world looks to you. The subtle stuff is fun, and there's less pressure about the subtle stuff, right? Too, so it makes it a little more light. And maybe you come across some big stuff on the way too. So, does this mean that we can understand the karma of every single action? The answer to that, unfortunately, or I guess, is no. The world is super complex. So every action that we take leads to lots of different effects. And every effect has too many causes that feed into it. So you can't just always know, well, I said this, so I got that response, and this particular thing I said at this time caused that. It's just the world's too complicated for that. But you can still see general patterns, and you can still tweak your behavior and speech and see differences and know that it may be not every time, but most of the time, things go better when I do this instead of that. So it's not like completely ambiguous, but it's not completely transparent either, just because there's so many moving parts in the world. There's weather, there's, whatever. But we can start to pay attention to our own intentions on a moment-to-moment basis, and we can begin to enjoy the benefits of orienting ourselves toward what we truly deeply value, like what we're going to care about looking back over our lives, like these sort of what we would like to drive our lives, those intentions, instead of the kind of default intentions that might, unexamined, take our lives in a way that's not as fulfilling or meaningful. So if we want to, for example, live in a harmonious world, we need to act with the intention of bringing people together instead of creating separation. Or let's say we want to live in a generous world. In that case, we need to want to share and be gracious with what we have. If we want to live in a kind world, we need to wish other people well. And that's the practice we're going to do today in our meditation, because it's one of my favorites. So living from these sorts of unconflicted and holistic intentions is deeply satisfying in itself. And that's what's so compelling about this, is it almost doesn't matter the outcome from other people. How it feels inside is whole, integrity, holistic, to be acting according to what your value toward what you actually think is important. Feels good in itself, but also it has a positive effect on others and the world around us, which is, of course, very important too. So reactivity can pull us away from living from such wholesome intentions. For example, when we're in the grip of greed and craving, generosity is not accessible. When we're taken over with anger or aversion, we are hardly likely to be open-hearted and considerate. And when we're caught in our biases, we're unlikely to bring people together and create harmony, just for examples. So we can't, fortunately or unfortunately, we can't control our emotions. And we can't control the outcome of our actions, because that's, again, too many moving parts. It's not just us. But we can work to improve our ability to respond thoughtfully to situations instead of reacting impulsively and unconsciously to our negative emotions. So the negative emotions are still going to arise. That's built in. But it's what we do with them that makes the difference. In this way, if we respond thoughtfully, the greed, hatred, and delusion that we all have won't run our lives, and we won't constantly be sabotaging our own happiness. I'm going to read you a fairly long quote This is from Bob Thurman, and I just can't say it better myself. And I think there would be something lost. So I'm going to read this to you. It's an excerpt from a book he wrote, and it's dealing with anger. And the reason I pull this one out specifically is I feel like in teaching, talking with people, that the greed and confusion are more straightforward. But sometimes anger seems appealing as a sort of energizer to create social change or deal with conflict. So I want to sell you against anger as a driving factor in speech and actions. And I just think he says it really well in terms of the karma. So this is from Bob Thurman. He says, it may be difficult at first for us to recognize that all actions driven by anger and hatred have negative consequences. He says, our usual tendency is to think of anger as somehow being our friend. And by the way, I just think this is cultural for us. So even if it's not you, it could be the people around you. We think of anger as somehow being our friend. We've been taught this. He says, remember how as a child, you would throw a temper tantrum, allowing your rage to burst forth in tears, flailing your limbs, and perhaps even shouting nasty words at your parents, such as, I hate you. If your parents eventually gave in to your wishes, you would feel triumphant. And by the way, a lot of these patterns we have started very young. Like the things that worked for us when we were very young, those are the ones that we kept doing. Sorry about the dog barking. So expressing your anger, he says, got you what you wanted. Only later as a mature adult do you realize the damage that you did, how badly you made your loving parents feel, how it tortured them to see you acting out like that. And you may even see that you harmed yourself by training yourself to react to difficult situations with anger. And if you have a different, that's only partway through the quote, but if you have your own different primary kind of action that you take that you don't like in certain situations, you can think back maybe to when that worked for you as a child, if you remember. You might not remember the first time, but it's like we get into a tough situation as a child and we do something, and at some point something works for us, and that's the thing that we keep doing. And everyone does this, and that's normal. It's just we want to now parent ourselves. When we were 4, we didn't know that wasn't the best way. And maybe it was the best way when we were 4, and now we have an opportunity to rewire. Okay, so back to Bob Thurman. He says, the key to quitting the anger habit cold turkey is to recognize that it's not at all our friend. He says it's addictive because it seems to bring us benefit. Then when it doesn't, it fools us into thinking we need more. The alcoholic has to overcome denial and admit that the alcohol itself is destroying him. The nicotine addict has to realize that her cigarettes are killing her. We anger addicts have to face up to the reality that anger is our enemy. He continues, when we take a closer look at reality, we see that the seemingly creative energy that comes from anger and serves to remove obstacles to our happiness is purely destructive. It can be difficult to realize this because when anger rises, it speaks to us with our own voice. When we give ourselves orders, we can only obey. When someone makes us angry, a voice within us that we feel is chief commander says, that's it, I can't take it anymore, I hate it, I'll make it stop, I'll get them back. We don't think of ourselves as obeying our own voice, he says. We think we're just directing ourselves naturally. But actually, our impulse is controlling us. And this is the mark of unconscious behavior. He says it's manipulating our mind, speech, and body like a child manipulates a doll. When anger rises, he says we don't own it, it owns us. It's not our friend or our tool. It fools us into feeling this way, and then we become its tool. A little bit more from him to wrap this up. He says, a central component of the destructiveness of anger is this feeling of helplessness you experience while you're in its grip. He says, just as a gun can't resist the trigger finger that causes it to shoot, even if its barrel is obstructed, and it will explode on itself when fired. So people in the grip of anger feel they can't stop themselves from taking the actions dictated by that passion, even if they're going to destroy themselves along with their target, which is what happens, right, with anger. As long as you're in control of yourself, he says, and able to choose your responses rationally, you may seem fierce, violent, or intemperate, but you're not really angry. He says, you're angry when you lash out blindly, when you're swept away by the feeling of utter hatred of your enemy, when you will stop at nothing less than the destruction of your target. So that's a lot. But I like how he sort of talks you through the description. And that kind of second to last sentence, he says, you may seem, fierce. And I think that that's important. I was, so I have this crazy puppy, and hiked with someone who's going to watch this video yesterday, and a different friend today. And he doesn't, he's afraid of strangers, and he's afraid of strange dogs. And he nipped the friend yesterday. And I had to, I mean, I don't want him to do that. It's not like he bit her. So I wasn't like angry, but I had to pull out the like super fierce mom voice and shout like, to get him to stop. And then today I was just more on it, different friend. And I just kind of, at the first peep of growling, or not growling, but making noises, I just made him stop by this super, fierce shouting voice. And it's funny because that's not my MO, but it speaks to him. He hears that, and he came over to me and sat and like licked my finger to apologize. Whereas the day before, it was out of control for a few minutes before I did that. So in that particular scenario, I have to sound angry for him to know that that's not okay. But I wasn't actually angry. It was a choice. So I like that freedom that he says, that you might seem fierce and that there are going to be times for that. But if you rationally choose to be fierce, that's different than uncontrollably wanting to destroy somebody else. And again, the reason I wanted to spend that much time on that is I've just found that that's the kind of lurking sort of attachment to negative emotions I feel like I've seen among a good percent of people in our culture, is this like, well, my anger is going to make me more effective in a political argument or whatever. And it just, we really want to look to see if that's actually true. And my argument is going to agree with Bob Thurman's that it doesn't work that way. So every time we act based on a negative intention, meaning an intention based on greed or ill will or bias, we reinforce and deepen the fear that underlies it. So this is the other kind of understanding of the mechanism of karma, is there's this kind of fear that drives those reactions. And then when you act on them, it gets reinforced. It seems very reasonable because you've now acted on it. That's how the mind works. Also, you've got all the effects, right? The ripple of effects, that's the karma. For example, is the person we harmed likely to be kind to us in the future? Did other people find out about it? Is our reputation intact? Most importantly, how does it make us feel about ourselves? So this is the crux of the issue. It's hard to go around with a negative impression of ourself. It's the opposite of a feeling of security. And this is why the Buddha said that loving kindness is the highest form of protection. And that may sound, when you first hear it, like, really? Being kind is going to be the highest form of protection. But it is, because you can feel good about yourself walking around. That's actual security. I'm not saying it's going to stop harm coming from someone else, but there's actually plenty of examples where that has actually happened, where someone was aggressive to, there's any number of great stories, to someone, and someone, instead of fighting back, said, hey, offered some kind of kindness or understanding, and the person was completely defused. And I've heard that stories of, muggings, and stories of saving someone else from violence, and it can happen. So that's a kind of security from loving kindness, that it diffuses anger. Not all the time, you can't count on it in someone else, but it might, rather than escalating it. And again, remember that loving kindness isn't being nice, and it's not being a doormat. It's being, it's thinking about what might be effective and caring about the situation. But that could be, it was kind for me to yell at my dog really loud so that he'd stop nipping my friend. I mean, that was kind to yell, right? So kind isn't nice and sweet and just saying yes to everything. And it's especially not a feeling of security to go around with a negative impression of ourselves if it feels out of control. And that's a hallmark of reactivity, when you just can't help but do that thing that you always do that always causes the problem, and then it happens again. So that's a sign when something's reactivity. Okay, so the path of holistic intention begins with the willingness to look at our own underlying purpose as we go about our daily lives. This can be challenging and honestly quite humbling, but it's worth doing, because it's those unexplored corners where we can really see what's going on and make change. And if we don't see it, we're not going to be able to work on it. And what's at stake is our own happiness and the happiness of the people around us. So when we see ourselves on the verge of acting from either mixed or unwholesome intentions, we can train ourselves to pause and to give our situation some thought. So some things that we might think about in that moment are, what might be the outcome of the way that we're about to act? And my first teacher used to say that actions from negative intentions are like throwing a brick into your future. And I used to use that image in my mind of this brick, like sailing forward, and I don't know when it's going to hit me, but it's going to hit me sometime. Is it worth it? It might not be worth it. And that might give pause. And I like the image, so if it works for you, picture the brick flying through the air, landing on you sometime. So we can ask ourselves in that moment, what would be a more loving, compassionate, or understanding response? Think about that, and then consider what the outcome of that response might be. You could consider, how would each of the outcomes feel to me? How would each of the outcomes feel to the other person? And ultimately, how would I feel about myself if I act this way versus that way? So this is how we can kind of talk ourselves down from the sort of habitual reactivity that maybe we learned from our families or we used as coping mechanisms when we're young, and start to shift into more helpful responses. This process requires patience, and it won't always be perfect. We need to offer ourselves compassion as we begin to untangle our complex inner world and to look into these dark corners. The benefit is that we start to feel good about our lives in ways, in very deeply satisfying and fulfilling ways. We begin to gain the confidence that comes from lack of inner conflict, a sense of living from integrity and care. So again, with the complexity of the world, we can't control the actual outcomes, but we can start to contribute to the healing of the world instead of being part of the problem. So let me just explain what I mean by healing of the world. Healing is not curing. So curing is like fixing things. And healing is like becoming whole. So I'm not talking about fixing things, although that, could happen too. But healing implies returning to wholeness. And that can be part of our orientation, to become whole and to encourage wholeness in others. What am I talking about with wholeness? Wholeness encourages knowing both the positive and the negative without denying or suppressing. So this comes back to the first teaching of the Buddha, to embrace all of life, to not sort of push away one part of ourselves and fixate on another part of ourselves or other people, but to be willing and able to train to hold the entire thing, to know the entire thing, to understand the entire thing. We can become whole through this practice as we don't hate parts of ourselves. Instead, we can learn and train to love the whole messy experience of being human. This feeling and practice is contagious, as we're able to love others as well as they are, warts and all, the good and the bad, because nobody's going to be all good or all bad, including ourselves. So it turns out that our intentions are like the air we breathe. We may not pay them much attention, but we're immersed in them and they permeate our experience. As we begin to focus here and clean up our way of being in the world, we beautify the world that we live in and feel immersed in the love and connectivity that we have to offer. This is the path not only away from suffering, but also toward true well-being. Comments, questions, thoughts, arguments on any of that?
I have a question, Karen. So I was thinking about when you were talking about anger and the Bob Thurman section, about my own personal form of reactivity tends to more fear. And I was trying to just substitute it in, but I wonder if you could expand a little bit about that.
Yeah, so sometimes when something happens that, I think fear drives the anger too.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, let's say, instead of being sort of blaming someone else, you kind of blame yourself or take it on personally to sort of fix the situation. Does that fit what you see your pattern as?
It's, even as you were saying that, I was kind of thinking that fear, and maybe my fear specifically, is it's kind of self-centered, right? It's focusing on, me. What are my feelings in this situation? Which is not the whole thing.
Well, the fear isn't necessarily unreasonable. I mean, we're talking very hypothetically. So, can you come up with a sort of not loaded example that's just kind of daily life?
Oh, sure. I'll make it a little bit loaded. So, I came from a long bad relationship and got divorced, and my ex was very always pointing out everything I did wrong, right? And so in my new relationship, where I'm trying to learn and do better, my boyfriend might say, "Oh, you left the printer on," and I just I like freeze up, like, "Oh, I'm so," I feel so all these negative emotions that are, totally inconsistent with the situation.
Yeah.
fear, sadness,
Yeah.
those kind of things.
So, I mean, so there's a couple things here that are really kind of juicy. And one of them is, yeah, it's sad to have, I mean, even though it's so interesting. So he's telling you left the printer on. He probably doesn't care that you left the printer on, right? And that's when it's interesting. That's when it's reactive. But what that usually comes from, when you have a response or reaction that doesn't fit the situation, but fits a previous situation,
Right.
this is what happens when we suppress emotions.
Aha.
So, and this happens to all of us. Okay. So you get in some difficult experience and you don't, for whatever reason, maybe you can't, right? Talk it out or, work through how you feel. And then what happens is that something benign down the road triggers a response that's out of proportion. And this is a great thing to know about because it'll happen to you. You will say something benign to someone and they will freak out. And
Yeah.
then, I've triggered a repressed emotion in that person. It's not really about me. I mean, you still have to deal with it. But this happens all the time. Jack Kornfield likes to say suppressed emotions. Suppressing your emotions is like being on a diet and hiding the chocolate chips from yourself, but only you know where they are. It doesn't work and they're going to come out later. So,
Work.
yeah. So when, what you could do in that situation is just be like, yeah, first of all, it's referring back like to a previous experience, but also to know, yeah, it's like, I want to feel, perfect in this person's eyes. So it's slightly sad that I did something that feels imperfect because somehow I think I'm supposed to be perfect, which we think about, even though that's the most absurd thing and under examination doesn't hold up. But yeah, and to acknowledge that tinge of sadness. Like it's okay to feel a tinge of sadness and a tinge of fear, even aside from the old stuff, right? That it's really triggering old stuff. But even in the present moment, like, yeah, not enough to like freak out over, right? If we under examination, but to actually allow ourselves to feel the wave of fear and sadness, like to start feeling little emotions. Well, there's the big part that's referring back, and then there's the little part that's in the moment, and to feel it. And what's fascinating about feeling it is then it goes away. And then you just move on to something else. Whereas if we suppress it, then we have to deal with it later. We don't get to deal with it now. And then it comes up later and makes a mess. And that doesn't mean when we go think about the things we suppressed in the past, like you may not really have had the opportunity to sort of the skills or the opportunity. So we don't want to look back and be like, well, I shouldn't have done that. I wasn't living well at that time or something. So it's not about that at all. But to start working on the things that we experience in the moment so that going forward, we're more in proportion. Our emotional responses will be more in proportion to what's happening. But that's such a great example. Did I answer your question? I know I didn't.
Yes.
Like
Yes.
okay.
It's very helpful. Thank you, Karen.
Great. Anybody else have anything come up?
I can confer with Robin. I've been in the exact situation. Just reactivity, boyfriend, even it ironically happened 2 weeks ago on our very first day of all this meditation course. And I was being really thoughtful of everything I had learned that first day. And he took my quiet response and turned it into assumption that somehow I thought he was like doing something wrong. And like, I would love to share this with him because it is just like spot on with like everything that's like been going on. So.
Yeah. It's so easy to trigger someone else's reactivity, just like it's easy to trigger ours. We're all kind of doing this all the time. But if we know that, it's less personal, right? And it's less scary. Like we know what's happening. I just pushed some button. Maybe someone gave him the silent treatment as a child when whatever, or as an adult. And
well, I was pausing to be mindful in my response and he just like took it the wrong way.
Yeah.
And then I was like, I don't want to get in an argument. Like, and then it just, it's like,
I'm
crazy.
guessing that you provoked reactivity in him because being quiet for a moment, which of course had good intentions from your side, maybe in the past he had negative experiences around that. So he got fearful. And then, so when we see that happen and we know he's not reacting to what you're really doing, because what you're really doing is kind, he's reacting to maybe past experiences, and to be able to then try to address that instead of taking it personally, saying, I feel like you're upset, but that's not what I was, you know. I feel like if we know we've triggered someone else's reactivity and then we don't take it as personally, we're gonna sound calmer when we talk about it. And I'm not saying that means that it's going to go well. But we just feel different inside. It's like, oh, I didn't do something wrong. We just sort of, our paths kind of crossed wrong in this moment. It's short circuited, and that's fixable. And you don't have to feel bad about, obviously, because what you did was good, right?
Yeah, I'm like, what's going on? So,
but just knowing, like, if we start to pay attention to our own reactivity, like, little things happen all the time. Little blips of like anger or sadness or whatever that don't really make sense, little blips of fear. And once we start to see that in ourselves, it's going to make a lot more sense why people are acting so wacko. Right? Because something got triggered in them. Some random little thing that's nothing to us triggered something for them. That's how reactivity works. But if we know that, it's like, okay, this is happening all the time. We need to be the steady, sort of, to the best of our ability, rational, calm, kind, understanding people who say, okay, I just triggered you. I wonder how I'm going to get us out of this. And when you don't know someone that well, you might not get yourself out of it. And but as you work with people well, and you start to get in more of groups, you start to figure out what gets them going and how to get out of it. And I don't know, I think it gets better. Thanks for sharing that. Anything else from anyone? Yeah, Lauren, but you're muted. I'm gonna, yeah.
Okay, I'm kind of new with the mute thing, so you might have to tell me, because I didn't join in as much. But I just wanted to say, like, I'd say mostly my reactions are mostly sadness, and I act out of fear a lot, but lately some things have manifested into more anger, and I'm not saying it's never been that way, but it's like a hard pill to swallow, kind of like. But a lot of the stuff you said, it was like, ooh, you're like, kind of like, oh, I don't want to believe that, or accept that. But then it's like, it seems real, but it's just hard to accept, I guess, some of that stuff about anger.
Yeah.
But it's helpful to hear you say it, to hear some clearance on, like, truth of that. Yeah, so thank you.
Yeah. Like a lot of this stuff is a little hard to swallow, or a lot hard to swallow. I will never forget when I first, so I'm trying to like untangle my relationship with my mom over the course of, I don't know, the 15 years of serious practice. And I remember a moment where I sort of saw that there was this role I had taken on in my family when I was very young that nobody asked me to take on. Like, I sort of thought someone's got to do this, like, take charge thing. So I did, and I was, 5 or something. And then that was always my role going forward, but I couldn't control everything. And anyway, I had this moment, and I remember because I was sitting in my kitchen downstairs, I'm sitting on the stool, and I had this flash of like, oh my God, I did this to myself. No, I mean, I was 5. So whatever. It's not like I saw 20,000 choices and made this super rational choice. It was just what I did, and it worked. Like I'm talking about with these other patterns. But it was, my stomach dropped to the floor. I was like, nobody asked me to do that. I chose this, what ended up to be somewhat frustrating path through my family of trying to manage a situation that wasn't manageable. And Just a lot of frustration and a lot of resentment, and it didn't have to happen. So in that first moment, I just remember, and it's happening now as I talk about it, my stomach just dropped to the bottom, and I thought, oh, this was all like completely unnecessary. And then 10 seconds later was just this huge freedom, this huge openness feeling of acknowledging something that was true that I hadn't seen. And somehow in acknowledging it, it just opened up. So even though there was the moment of sinking, like, oh my God, and sort of in that moment, like, I'm a horrible person, feeling like, why did I have to try to control everybody? Like, it just seemed so negative and gross. And then 10 seconds later, it was like poof, it was like a cloud, like it's been seen. Okay, well, whatever, I was 5. So I made the wrong choice, or who knows if it was the wrong, if there was a better choice. But in turning towards yucky stuff, even though there's this moment of like, oh no, on the other side is the opposite of repressed emotions. It's integration, it's being able to move forward with openness, it's lightness. And you have to try it to take my word for it. But for me, it really works. It's just not as bad as it seems. Like hidden stuff down, it seems horrible. And then you look at it and it's like a moment of dismay. And then all of a sudden it's not being, you don't have all the anxiety of holding it down anymore. And it's just, that's freedom on the other side. Yes, Jennifer.
How does the shadow practice integrate with what you're talking about?
I mean, I don't know exactly what you're talking about, but I assume it's the exact same thing. Which is, a lot of descriptions of enlightenment are like bringing that stuff that's unconscious into consciousness and being willing to look at our dark sides as well as our light sides. That's actually, I mean, that's what the first teachings of the Buddha are about, right? Embrace all of life. And it's easy to embrace the nice stuff when we want to embrace the stuff we've been afraid to look at too. And that coming from that's the wholeness and the healing that I'm talking about. It may not fix anything, but acknowledging everything feels integrous. It feels whole. And that's the definition of healing that I was using.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's do a little practice. So let's take a moment to settle ourselves here in the body. Feeling the sensations of the body, feeling the kind of three-dimensional experience of the body, and grounding ourselves here simply by feeling the sensations and knowing them. We'll allow our breath to settle into a natural rhythm, however the body chooses to breathe. And this observing the breath in the body is a centering, calming technique that we can do really anytime. You can just do this for a split second in the middle of other activities or whatever, and just kind of tune in and feel connected. And we're going to do some loving kindness practice today, or friendliness is a better translation. So we're going to repeat some phrases silently in our mind. Traditional way to practice. So I'd like you to say to yourself silently, may I be well and truly happy. May I be well and truly happy. So this is just offering yourself the wish. It's not like an affirmation saying, I am happy or anything. That's way more gentle than that. It's offering wholesome intention to yourself. So we just kind of drop the phrase into the mind. May I be well and truly happy. And you don't have to worry about whether that's easy to say or hard to say, or whether you feel it 100% or 50% or 0%. It's more like a suggestion for the mind. And on repetition, it starts to seem more and more reasonable over time. May I be well and truly happy. Offering this wish to yourself. And maybe you sort of feel like you're radiating this wish throughout your body. May I be well and truly happy. Again, we're cultivating the intention. You don't have to worry about the outcome. And if you wish the phrase was different, change the phrase. You're welcome to use your own words. May I be well and truly happy. And now let's expand this wish out to all beings everywhere, including yourself. May we be well and truly happy. And there's different ways to do this. Sometimes I like to sort of picture one individual after another, not too quickly. And wish this person well and then wish that person well. Another way to do it is kind of imagine all beings everywhere and wish them all at the same time. And there's no right or wrong. But cultivating this intention to wish others to be well, including ourselves, and truly happy. And if you liked the radiating through the body before, you can imagine it radiating through your body, each wish, and out into the world, kind of like on the wind, however you want to picture it. Spreading out everywhere in the world, including animals, including insects. May we be well and truly happy. So this is cultivating a kind of underlying intention through which we might meet the world. May we be well and truly happy. Any questions or anything come up about that brief loving kindness practice? Simple but effective. Feels good, right? Okay, I have two quotes for you, short ones. The first is from Suzuki Roshi. He says, the most important thing is to remember the most important thing. And then our second quote is from William Blake. He says, if one is to do good, it must be done in the minute particulars. General good is the plea of the hypocrite, the flatterer, and the scoundrel. Thank you. Have a great week. I'll see you on Monday.